Our scripture this morning comes from Mark 8, verses 27 through 38. It's on page 1055 if you'd like to follow along in your pew Bible. Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Christ." Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men." Then he called the crowd to him, along with his disciples, and said, "If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for a man to gain the whole world, yet forfeit his soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels."
I think I'm going to try to actually use the pulpit today. Shocking as that is. A little bit tired, and I want to use a really old movie illustration for you. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Bruce Almighty. I know I'm getting a little more gray in my beard as I make references like that, but in the movie there's this Jim Carrey plays this guy named Bruce, and Morgan Freeman plays God. And God gives Bruce a taste of what it's like to be in his shoes. And it's a comedy, it's pretty funny. I like Jim Carrey movies though, but you might not. But anyway, in the movie, Bruce sees God a couple times before he recognizes him for who he is. And I actually want to play a little clip from the movie as this character meets God, and if everything works well with my phone, I should be able to do it from here. And if it doesn't work, then I'll run screaming to the back. So, let's see here.
You're looking for room 7. Hello? Yeah, seems to be. Kind of bright though.
Yeah, it is for most people. Spend their lives in the dark, trying to hide from it.
Well, the elevator's broken, huh?
Yeah, but I'll get around.
You install the clapper?
No, but catch it, Dave, isn't it?
Clapper, 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 the clapper.
Just can't get it out of my head, man.
Oh, good luck with that.
Okay, with the boss B ran out. You must be Bruce. I've been expecting you.
This is hilarious. So you're the boss and the electrician and the janitor. Must be a killer Christmas party. Don't get drunk though. One of you might need a ride home.
rolling up his sleeves either, son. People underestimate the benefit of good old manual labor. It's freedom in it. Some of the happiest people in the world go home smelling the high heaven at the end of the day.
What is this? I didn't bother and had to get my pager number.
Oh, I know quite a lot about you, Bruce. Just not everything there is. Everything you've ever said, or done, or thought about. Right there in that file cabinet.
Wow, a whole drawer just for me. Mind if I take a look?
Sure.
Sounds good.
This gas entry was a little disturbing. The gloves are off, God. God has taken my bird and my bush. God is a mean kid with a magnifying glass. Smite me, almighty, smite me.
So it's an interesting movie and a really funny premise for a movie. But I think it points us to the truth. I mean, we can kind of see God at work, but if we don't have eyes to see it, we can't really always recognize what's going on. And how we answer the question of who is Jesus affects the orientation of our whole lives. Some people today think that Jesus was just a prophet. Or some even go so far as to say that Jesus never lived at all. I don't think there's very many serious historians that would disagree with, but that would agree with that. But many find the claims that Jesus was the Messiah or that Jesus was God to be offensive. As C.S. Lewis put it, Jesus can either be a liar, a lunatic, or a Lord. And he doesn't really leave easy choices for us about what we can do with him. And I think in our day we could add another L. We could add legend to that list of three. But the foundation of the Christian life of faith is rooted in who Jesus is, and it's whether or not he really was who he claimed to be. And I think if we build our lives without recognizing that fact, it's like building a roof before we have built the foundation. And I think when it comes to faith, there's so many people who focus so much on external things that are really inconsequential, things like the building or the programs or the preaching or the music, even the color of the carpet. But if we would live in earnest and be disciples of Jesus, it starts with who Jesus is, and we have to work outward from there. Jesus asked the disciples what other people thought about who he was, but then he asked the disciples who they understood him to be. And at the heart of it, who is Jesus is not just a historical question, it's a personal question. How we answer that one question becomes the frame of reference for how we see the whole world, our relationships with others, and the priorities of how we live. Some try to answer that question in a way that pretends to be objective. But how we answer that question about who Jesus is shows us where the ultimate authority in our lives really lies. For some, ultimate authority is found in Jesus. For others, in the scientific method. Still others, the opinions of psychologists or historians. But to answer that question, to come to the question of who Jesus is with an open mind, means that we allow ourselves the possibility that Jesus could be the Messiah, that Jesus could be God incarnate. Or both. I mean, this is not, as C.S. Lewis put it, this is not a small what if that we're asking here. And Mark is a gospel that really focuses on some details and leaves out a lot of others. But he doesn't give a lot of the details of this conversation between Jesus and Peter that we see in, say, the Gospel of Matthew. Peter just says, Jesus was the Christ. And with Mark, I think we see a little bit different emphasis here. So we see the focus on who Jesus is, move on to answering the question question of why does it matter, and then to how shall we live. That's really essentially what Mark's gospel is setting up. It's setting us to see the gospel and preparing us to understand what we're being told. And so rather than drag Matthew's gospel into the conversation this morning, I just want to stick with what Mark has to say. But here's the deal. If you answer the first question any way other than Jesus was the Messiah, it means you're never going to approach any of these other questions that Mark is trying to address. Mark points us in the direction of understanding what did Jesus do for humanity. But if we've already ruled out that Jesus can't speak his truth into that part of our lives, we're never going to move past that. We're never going to find anything if we have already denied Jesus the authority to tell us anything about what he's done. And so we move on to that question, why does it matter? Or what did Jesus do for humanity? And Mark doesn't give us all the information about this here, but in predicting his death, he does hint at the significance of what's going on. He says that after his trial and death that he would be resurrected in 3 days. And I think a lot of people have good questions about this. Why did Jesus have to die? What does it mean by the Son of Man must suffer? But first, I think in order to understand that, you have to look at Jesus' favorite title for himself, which is the Son of Man. In our call to worship this morning, we read from Daniel 7. This is what Jesus is referencing as he uses that title about himself. And it reveals who Jesus is, I think, in a very interesting way. When we hear Son of God or Son of Man, we think that when we say Son of God, we're thinking about, it's talking about Jesus' divinity. When we hear Son of Man, we think it's talking about Jesus' humanity. But that's actually the complete opposite of what is being expressed there. Son of God doesn't have anything to do with Greek stories about Hercules or things like that. It actually has to do with more like what we think about Adam, who was a son of God by virtue of his unique creation. And likewise, Son of Man is a title that we think emphasizes Jesus' humanity, but it's actually pointing to this verse from Daniel. It's pointing out that Jesus is someone who has been given authority and glory and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshiped him. This is not a person. If it was a person, then this would be idolatry. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. That's what Son of Man is meant by Jesus. In a Monty Python skit, there's this really funny line where they say, "No one expects the Spanish Inquisition." I just love that line. I know it's kind of dangerous to quote Monty Python, but in a way, no one was expecting the resurrection. No one was expecting the resurrection. So as Jesus says that he's going to be resurrected in 3 days, it seems so outlandish. It seems so outlandish that Peter himself comes and says something akin to, "Whoa, Jesus, calm down there, big boy. I think you've gone a little bit off the deep end." Most Jewish people believed in a resurrection, but they believed that it was primarily a big event for everyone at the end of the age. And in this way, one could say that the resurrection was not something that was tied to any kind of messianic prophecy that anyone in Jesus' day would have understood as such. But Jesus showed up and he changed all that. And so though Peter and the other disciples never would have imagined the full extent about what Mark is hinting here as they're living out this story, we get to see the story beyond the short-sightedness of the people who lived it. Ways that they would only understand it later, that Jesus was fully God and fully human. That he was, as mind-boggling as it is, that God took on flesh and suffered and died. And that's a strange mystery, but it's a mystery that has a purpose behind it. And that purpose is our benefit. It was so we could have a restored relationship with God, or what they call atonement, which is a word, if you break down, means at one-ment with God. And in his resurrection, Jesus showed the disciples and his other followers that he was who he claimed to be. Not in a way that they would automatically understand, but in a way that they never would have expected. And I really believe in historical cultural study, and I don't want to bore you guys with no one in the Greek world would have been able to grasp that God could take on flesh and become incarnated. They would especially struggle with the idea of God suffering. That is something that would be completely beyond their wildest imaginations. And people in the Jewish world, many would have expected a Messiah, but they would have expected the Messiah to come more as a military ruler, as a leader who would free them from the Roman oppression. And no one would expect the Messiah himself to be divine. That's why I think Jesus uses that title, Son of Man, so often. And no one would expect him to die, let alone suffer. And even among Jesus' closest disciples, no one could have grasped the idea that Jesus would be resurrected. And just historically, and I know I'm a huge history nerd, no less than 8 people, 100 years on either side of Jesus' life, showed up and claimed to be the Messiah. They grew an army to drive out the Romans, and they failed, and they died, and I can only tell you a handful of their names, and you probably never even knew that they even existed. But no one's talking about them anymore. Not one person cares. But Jesus we're still talking about today. And we do that because Jesus didn't just show up and tell people what they wanted to hear. He changed the whole frame of reference about who the Messiah was and what he was about and what he would accomplish and how. And when Peter confronted Jesus about it, he was thinking that Jesus had gone off the deep end. Jesus had some powerful words for him. Get behind me, Satan. You don't have in mind the concerns of God with the limited concerns of humans. I did Jim's funeral this week, and there's a part of it that I wrote as a part to help people understand what the gospel is. And I want to quote this part of that sermon because I think it puts the gospel in plain language that is helpful for us today. If you don't know what the gospel is, this is it. Jesus, fully God and fully man, came to our broken world with a heart broken by love, broken for his creatures and his creation. He came not to condemn the world, but to save it, to turn our hearts back to God so that we could walk with him. Jesus wanted to show us what it means to truly live. And Jesus lived a life among us humans as a man in every way, except for not giving in to sin. He was falsely condemned, faced a mockery of a trial, and was killed on the cross of an insurrectionist. He became a sacrifice on our behalf that took in the sin of the world into himself and absorbed it. He made a way for us when there was no other way to get back to having a restored relationship with God, proving it by his resurrection and ascension to heaven, where he is still interceding on our behalf, still reaching out to the world through his church and through the power of the Holy Spirit. He offers the world new life in him and the power to overcome the chains of sin that hold us down. And I went on to tell a lot of the people in that crowd who like a threat. It seems like an ultimatum, a choice that we could either turn or burn. But the gospel is not a threat, it's an invitation. It's not merely a ticket to heaven, but an invitation to a journey with God now. To one day sit and sup at the great wedding feast of the Lamb. And the Christian life isn't just knowing the right answers to a theology test at the pearly gates or fire insurance policy for the afterlife. It is the power of God for a victorious life now. It's an opportunity to be transformed by the work of Jesus on the cross and the power of the Holy Spirit. The gospel is an offer to experience meaning and purpose, something worth living for and dying for, an adventure to be lived with God. That's how I try to describe the gospel to people sitting in that funeral service.
Amen.
But it's only when we understand the redemption story of what God did for us that we can really get to the personal part, the question of how then shall we live. Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny himself and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels." I think this is another allusion to what Daniel was saying. And like Peter, I think when we hear those words, we want to rebuke Jesus. You know, we think, how rude. who is this guy that he would say things like that? I thought Jesus was supposed to be such a nice guy. You know, and I think we resist that because we have kind of an entitlement about us. We have this kind of pushback, this kind of inner rebelliousness that says, I don't know if I want to go that far with my relationship with God. We want a Jesus plus sort of faith. Jesus plus what I was already going to be doing anyway. It's so easy for us to only want the veneer of a Christian faith, the kind of commitment that's better suited to the Rotary Club than the kingdom of God. As C.S. Lewis once put, many people settle for a half-hearted form of faith that's more like an inoculation than a full-blown version of the disease. And rather, what Jesus wants is a God-first life from his followers. My friend Dave, who, praise the Lord, is sitting in the back right now, he has this book that's called What You Don't Have to Believe to Become a Christian. And there's this chart in there he showed me a couple times that is really helpful. And I wish I would have had a picture of it to throw up on the projector here. But it's this graphic of the book that shows what is at the center of a proper Christian life and what's at the center of a non-Christian life. And ultimately, this little graph shows us that in a non-Christian life, there are all these selfish interests that are warring with each other about which one will ultimately define us. And with God as the source of our identity, all these things are transformed and changed, and they're held in the proper tension, and we get to live a life of freedom because God basically reigns in us. And these are all things that, without God in our lives, would distract and derail our lives being held in that healthy balance. And to me, when I hear about Jesus' words like taking up our crosses and following him, or whoever will save their life will lose it, I think of it as a way of just describing what it's like to have God reign in us. This reigning changes our whole perspective and our whole direction in life. If we let God have us completely, it will be costly, Jesus warns us. But what we gain, no one can ever take away from us. The God-first life is hard to describe for somebody who hasn't experienced it. It's hard to put into words what it's like to be stretched and growing in these ways. But perhaps the problem, if we're struggling with this kind of growth, is that something is blocking us from going forward. We can look back at these questions and think, where am I in this? If we're ashamed of our faith or seeking our own priorities rather than God's priorities, we might need to ponder, what is at the center of our lives? If we're wrestling with our identity as children of God, perhaps we should take a step back and look at if we've really accepted the atonement, if we've really enjoyed that at one with God that we're supposed to have. Sometimes we even deny the purpose that Jesus came to seek and save us. And ultimately, if we're not growing and we're not really even there yet, maybe we need to go all the way back to the beginning, to asking ourselves, who is Jesus to us? For God to reign in us and for us to experience the fullness of what God offers us today, it starts with who Jesus is, then accepting what he's done, before we can really live into that truth that will set us free. And in Mark, as we're building up toward Easter here, we see Mark setting the stage for the gospel, helping us put all the pieces together so that when we see what Jesus does, we can understand what's going on. We can see Jesus rightly, and we can live rightly in response. And so as Mark sets the stage for the gospel story, I want to ask you this morning, where's your heart in the midst of this? Do you have this opportunity to examine your own heart, and will you do that? Because discipleship is hard. It's not something for people who are lukewarm, who are going to pursue this path. Discipleship in following Jesus is really a radical thing. It will reorientate everything about your life. There's a 70s rocker named Alice Cooper that probably only half of you know who that is. But this was a guy who regularly, he did all the drugs that you could imagine on a regular basis. He regularly trashed hotel rooms, like every hotel room he stayed at for a decade. He just completely destroyed it, and then they would just send him a check, to repair it. He even had a song called No More Mr. Nice Guy. And when he found Jesus, he found that he started to struggle with what that would mean. And his quote about that is that following Jesus is the most rebellious thing that he's ever done. You're rebelling against even yourself at this stage. You're rebelling against everything that you have, everything the world cares about. You're changing all the priorities of your life. And so, make no mistake, following Jesus is a radical thing. It will require sacrifice. But living for God is something that I can tell you right now, living a God-first life is something I have never regretted, not one day. I'm not saying I've had an easy life, but I can tell you that I'm free of regrets. Because I know that if I didn't follow God, that I would spend the rest of my life wondering, what if? What happened? What did God really want from me that I was hindering my heart? And learning to recognize Jesus has changed the way that I see everything, everyone, the past, the present, the future, even eternity. Jesus asked Peter, and he asks each of us, who do you say that I am? He asks us to trust him, that though there's this crazy mystery, the gospel story, that there's this strange and bittersweet love story between God and humanity, when we accept what Jesus did for us and God's power begins to work in us, only then will we let our earthly perspective truly die. And only then can we find the new life that God promises us. It's only when our eyes are opened that we can look at ourselves with a heavenly perspective, that the upside-down priorities of God can take root, and we can let our hearts be conformed to the pattern of the cross. There's a lot of things in the Christian life that you can take or leave. Choice of music, or the carpet, or all these other things. There's a lot of big things out there that really don't have anything to do with who Jesus is. But who Jesus is to us is the foundation for absolutely everything, for any way that you can grow in the Christian life. And it's only when our compass is set by that question that we can escape the tyranny of all those other drives that will run us over and drag us down. And we can learn to stand on our own 2 feet and begin to walk in the right direction with God. We have no control over what other people think about who Jesus is. But what's perhaps the most important thing is, who is Jesus to us? It really is a personal question. And if we truly wrestle through that with an open mind, then we can get to that place where we can truly wrestle with whether we're going to choose to follow him to freedom, or whether we're going to just stay behind where we're already at. So I leave you with those questions this morning, and I just want to, as we go into our time of open worship, I just want you to think about, who is Jesus? At what point of the gospel are we stuck? And how is it that God can transform us as we seek to be obedient disciples for him?